of the places in the United States where there is no light pollution, none. And what you see when you go outside at night is unlike anything else you see in any city, or even in places that have relatively low light pollution. I mean, literally the Milky Way has like come to Earth. Last night we were out there standing on the porch, and it literally seemed as if there was a waterfall of stars out of the heavens right down into the mountainside next to our camp. I mean, it's just unfreaking believable.
That is cool.
And it's the end of the Perseid meteor shower right now. So there's tons of meteorites and shooting stars, and Venus is out there super bright. And it's the nighttime here is both incredibly beautiful and somewhat overwhelming, because you've never seen a night like that unless you go out to like northern Canada or someplace, or some other part of the United States, like I said, of which there are very few, with a limited, there literally are no lights.
Yeah.
There are just no lights anywhere. So you can really see the sky.
Yeah. I really feel you should tell everyone that just been hopping on while this description is taking place, the unofficial sponsor of this, where your cabin's coming from, because that was if that was the best advertisement for coming to if you're going to go to a retreat somewhere. So you want to tell people where you're at?
Yeah, that's true. I am at Ring Lake Ranch, which is a rest and renewal center, a retreat center, outside of Du Bois, Wyoming. And it's about 90 miles east of Jackson, Wyoming. So that's where I am. This is actually my house for the next 2 weeks. This cabin it's not huge, but it's home.
Nice.
And there's a nice porch out that way that has a beautiful view of the Absaroka Mountains, and it's just really gorgeous. Right in front of me there's a window, and it has a view of a mountain range that is around a place called Trail Lake. It's part of the Wind River Mountains, and then behind me that direction is more of the Wind River Mountains, the high desert, and part of the Shoshone National Indian community, which is a very big preserve that the Shoshones live on now. So anyway, yeah, this is where I am. There are several people from the cottage community and homebrewed communities who came to this retreat, and they literally are here.
That's awesome.
Last night they asked me if they could come and sit in my cabin while we taped, and I just laughed because I said, well, Tripp's going to be on the headphones, so you won't be able to hear him. But they are somewhere on the property. They're sitting in their cabins, and hopefully they have decent internet, because it's a little iffy in certain places, and they're actually going to watch this together, and I guess I'll hear about it tonight at dinner.
That's awesome.
So yeah, and it's not the particular retreat that I'm leading this week is with a friend of mine, and it's called Writing in the Wilderness, and it's on the spiritual practice of writing and reading. And then next week I'm co-leading a retreat with Marianne Borg, Marcus Borg's widow, and we're doing a camp on wisdom. Doing a wisdom camp. And
you support wisdom?
I do. I support it.
All right.
So anyway, that's where I am. Wyoming. Welcome to Wyoming. It's really not as bad as what you hear in the news, and it's been beautiful out here.
Yes. Well, Richard. Does everyone see Richard in the comments? Link. Yeah,
Richard's sitting on the porch.
Yeah, his comment thing said to host and panelist, and I don't know if everyone could see because he was typing the link to the thing. So if not, anyone that's comment, I open the chat because now Zoom keeps it closed unless you open it. But make sure when you type in, it says for everyone and not just host and panelists.
I
So
just heard Richard shout, "Ah!"
yes, there we go.
So,
All
so
righty.
there you go.
All right, I'm going to hit record. And yes, I want to record it. You're correct. All righty. Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am here with Diana Butler Bass. And guess what we're going to do?
We are going to
ruin your dinner. Oh, you see?
Ruin siesta time in Wyoming.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to do this. And now, normally, for those of you that are joining live that aren't a part of the cottage community or homebrewed community, this happens regularly. And the coolest way to show your support to high quality content creators on the internet like Diana Butler Bass is to join the Substack community, where right now is like your year anniversary taking place.
Yes, 1 year.
I know. And so as someone who is wanting to, one, support their friend, but also peer pressure those of you that are listening to this on the podcast or in any free channel to join the cottage. One, if you join the cottage for the next year, then Diana will send you a code for $100 off Theology Beer Camp, which means you'd get the biggest discount possible for Theology Beer Camp, get more off than a year of supporting the cottage, and get to hang out with us for 3 days in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, with a bunch of our friends, a bunch of our my fellow podcast friends are going to be there. Some really cool theologians. And it's going to be a good old time. So Diana, you need tell them how to sign up for the cottage plus or premium or whatever it is means that they keep your writing and public work sustainable and alive.
Well, most of the people who are here on the live stream right now are actually already supporting members of the cottage, because this is one of the special things I offer them, is that they can get into these live streams and send in questions and all that kind of stuff. So this will be repetitive for those good friends and those great supporters of mine. But for other people who don't, you just go to the cottage at Substack, or you go to my website, Diana Butler Bass, and it says sign up for my newsletter. And you hit that button and it takes you over to the cottage, and it will give you options to sign up for free. And there's lots of great free content. I'm happy if people are there in any capacity. I want you to be part of the community. And it does really, 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 really help if you become a paid supporter, because the cottage does not write itself. I have to be able to make it work.
AI is not that effective yet.
That's right. I have to make it work. You get paid for your work. And also, I'm really hoping it's becoming successful enough that I'm really hoping to hire on an assistant this year. And that will make my life even more focused on writing, and I hope improve the overall experience of everybody at the cottage. So if you choose to support me financially, choose to support this work, choose to be part of the paid community, I am infinitely grateful. And you're doing something that's really special, because I get emails every week from people all over the world who have gotten something from the cottage, and that we are encouraging folks to thinking about a different kind of Christianity. So it's been a great year. It's been a great year. Thank you. I don't get to say that so
getting
much
to hang
to
out.
people. Yeah. And we've had so much fun doing this as part of the cottage and homebrewed in partnership. So
if I know some people that are joining the live stream, especially the ones on the Zoom, are members of homebrewed community or yours, but it's also on Facebook and YouTube, and will be on the Homebrewed podcast. So for the other 50,000 people that download it, if you love hanging out with Diana Butler Bass half as much as I do, then join the cottage, get the secret code from her, get $100 off to come to beer camp. If you make a poor life decision and don't join the cottage, you can use the code RUININGDINNER with no space and get $50 off. But
so while we're doing all this pre-chat Tripp, I just have to tell you, my daughter Emma, she was asking what I was doing this fall, kind of what my event schedule were. And I said, well, I'm going to this church and I'm doing this lecture at Duke. And then I said, oh, and I'm speaking at Theology Beer Camp. And she goes, Theology Beer Camp? There's a Theology Beer Camp? She's 24. And it was like,
Yeah,
you're kidding. And I said, no, you want to come?
I know. She can get a free ticket. They'll also, I have heard that there's such a large concentration of 21 to 35-year-old single progressive men that are there. There's a number of relationships that started at beer camps where where it was like, how do you find it after you finish college, committed progressive Christians? It's not like there's lots of them at a church. You go to beer camp, and then they listen to Diana talking, and then they see, oh, they're paying attention too. Ooh, hi, friend. Yeah. Anyway, so it's gonna be
Tripp,
fun.
I guess you don't know that my daughter runs the other direction.
Well, there's no, I don't have. Well, I met her once, right?
Right. She's not terribly interested in progressive Christian men.
Well, the progressive, high concentration of progressive Christians in general. But
there you go.
Guess what I have here? I'm giving it to you. At Theology Beer Camp, and I haven't opened it to see this, but this is the Queen's Jubilee tea set. Or no, what her?
Oh, look at that! Oh, Tripp, thank you.
Look at this.
That's beautiful.
So for those of you just listening, before I left Edinburgh, what was the big celebration? Platinum Jubilee of
70.
Her Majesty. And Diana was like, "Can you get one of the special tea sets?" Well, let me tell you, I had no idea that the Queen had so many fancy tea sets, and the level of hype around it. But I went by the Queen's Palace and got it. Something I can't do anymore. Can't go by a Queen's Palace. But
well, sorry about that. But hey, Greensboro is a great place.
Yeah, it's not as old as everything in Greensboro was built after New College was built in Edinburgh. That's how, yeah.
That's how new it is. Well, let's get started with the news, because we have been having so much fun catching up with each other. I hope that people don't mind our chatter, because it's just really great to see you. And you're in your new house in North Carolina. So that's true. That's the best thing.
I have like books behind me now. I'm trying to catch up, trying to impress people, because you've always had the highest Zoom background game. Yes. And now we got books. All right. So, Valier, who's here, sent in a question. I think it's a fun one to start, because you're actually locally present for Liz Cheney's home state. She recently lost the nomination for the Republican House seat, the one House seat from the state. And Valier asked about the consequences, or how to understand this moment, especially in relationship to public discourse around truth or truthiness and the like thinking about the kind of growing snowball of kind of all the inertia around the inability to have a sustained, clear public dialogue. Like, what do you think Cheney loss there represents?
Oh, in some ways it's a little shocking. I mean, everybody predicted that she was going to lose. So in that sense, it wasn't shocking. And it also wasn't shocking that since we've been here, I think we saw like one or two Liz Cheney signs, and we saw a lot of Trump signs. Not so many for the other person who won. I don't even know, her name is Hageman or something like that. But it was more like, pro-Trump stuff. And so it was pretty obvious, that she was going to not succeed. But, I think about, her father, he's been a fixture in politics here for so long. And when Liz ran initially, I guess it was 2010, was that when she came in the big suite? No, she was in 2016. Everybody just was like, oh, well, that's a no-brainer. She's going to win. And she did. Oh, Richard's putting in the chat. We were here in 2016. We were, when she was running the first time. We weren't happier about that. Yeah, because of course, who loved Dick Cheney? And Liz is always considered being kind of the knockoff of her dad. Well, her sister Mary, who is a partner, a married lesbian, was always considered to be a little bit more like her mom. And so, Liz was the female version of Dick Cheney, and who wanted that? But then, everything has changed about the Republican Party. And the idea that I've had a harder time getting used to in the last year is that Dick Cheney's daughter has been the defender of democracy.
Yeah, it's a weird one.
That seems weird to me. Doesn't
It's
that
a
seem
weird
weird to
one.
you?
Yeah, I don't know what to do about it, because if I was power ranking horrible presidents, I still got George W. over Donald Trump because of the kill list that he took out. And we don't have to detour into exactly how the 2000 election ran, but there's lots of questionable things around that. That and being a war criminal who signed a waterboarding jug.
Right.
That was, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I haven't come back around to be part of the Cheney fan club.
Right.
And I do find it weird, certain people that did, but it is one of those predicaments where you're sitting there going, democracy doesn't work unless you have at least two parties. And now the person on the other, like all the people that voted for impeachments are leaving, getting voted out or retiring or whatever. Like if you don't have at least two political parties, and I think it would be better if we had more, democracy has a hard time functioning. And so, yeah, it's so wild I haven't been able to make sense of people getting so pumped about Liz Cheney, when you're like, the bare minimum of that she did was, not hate democracy. And now we're like, wow, at least we have that one Republican.
Well, yeah, and there's like two of them, I guess. But but
Adam Kinzicker's not running again, right?
Yeah, I know he stepped out. But I think I do think it's kind of like mind blowing to think in the last decade. We basically watched the Republican Party first become the Dick Cheney Party, because all of the worst things basically that happened under the Bush administration were Dick Cheney's bailiwick. He was the one who was really pressing into that whole policy about torture, the whole thing about Iran, the whole business about extracting all the oil from the Middle East and basically turning them into sort of a Middle East Texas for American oil companies to be able to get even richer on. And so that kind of big oil, big Halliburton, big industry, neoliberal take over the world stuff. That was all Dick Cheney. That was not really George Bush. I've never been a real Bush fan, but there are ways that there are some impulses that George Bush had that were actually decent, humane impulses. If you ever looked at his Africa policies and the ways in which people in the healthcare communities appreciated a lot of what Bush did, he really made a big difference about AIDS in Africa, and a lot of African nations are so very grateful for the way that he opened up relations with them. So that compassionate conservative thing that George W., I think, really was his kind of thing. If he had been allowed to run with that, had it not been for 9/11, I think that we might have had a slightly different GOP. But because of 9/11 and the fear factor just, bursting onto the scene, is that gave Dick Cheney that opening to, I think, execute in so many, not, if you'll pardon the expression, execute political policies that were really the vilest part of the GOP's foreign policy, sort of portfolio, as it were. So first we had the switch from any kind of even vague hopefulness of something called compassionate conservatism, which is, a lot of people think it was a myth anyway, but I'm willing to give George W. like the benefit of the doubt on it. But then it became Cheney's party. And then Cheney becomes too liberal for the rest of them. And then his daughter gets kicked out. And that is what's so stunning, is this is this two-step process by which the Republican Party has landed in a place that is, I mean, what words do we even use to describe this place, Tripp? I'm a writer. I have no words. I don't know what to call it.
Well, I think
hell, I mean, that's about all I got.
Even the way, Valier's questions function about like the nature of truth and truthiness in this context, and what does this represent? I mean, I think that what we're seeing is this kind of totalization of politics and identity, and that your tribal identity becomes your a priori commitment, and policies and justifications run after. So yeah, like there's this sense that and I would say it means I actually have to think about, am I doing the same thing when it comes to my own tribe? And is identity taking over, and then my justifications and convictions and things running after? It's a real predicament when so many of our relationships are now mediated by algorithms that want to hold our attention, generate our fear and anxiety, and this kind of thing. Then it's not surprising that there's this deepening shift, when before, if you think of what used to frame us for the public square, it was like public schools, thinking about civics, kind of the shared facts of a few news organizations and all these kinds of things. And then now access to knowledge, there's a politicization of even teaching civics and how the government works. There is now multiple partisan accounts of the history of America, and the good, the bad, the ugly. So many of the things that are kind of necessary for a diverse multi-ethnic population to figure out how we cooperate and commit to the democratic project, when they all disappear and they get changed over, then it's not surprising this has happened, but it's just shocking when you look at the other side. I think that's that Cheney, who, if you just went on her voting record, is about as conservative as it gets and makes me uncomfortable policy-wise for all sorts of things, is now, and she said it, right? Like, I knew how to win. I just had to lie. Like, and in fact, she could have voted with Democrats 50% more of the time on everything if she had just repeated Trump's, lie about the about the election and fraud and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they would have voted her back in.
Yeah, it's that tribal thing. And to me, that really connects with that your recent piece about bad blood and Civil War talk and all that kind of stuff. Which I remember you talking about when you were writing it. Then it comes out, and we were on the phone, and you're like, "You won't believe what all the pastors are saying to me about this piece." I'd love for you to take some time to frame the ideas that generated it, so we can unpack them and then have fun. We won't have fun, but we'll at least friendly conversation as we look at just the ramifications of it for the public square and for the life of the church.
Yeah, the piece there is, I wanted to try to say something that people weren't really saying about violence and religion. And so, I went back to, what I think is a really truly basic problem. And that is the idea of a sacrificial blood atonement being salvation. And it seems to be no coincidence in my mind that Christian nationalism actually depends on violence, and it depends on a theory about blood atonement in order to exist. You can't have Christian nationalism without the idea of some people have good blood and some people have bad blood. And so in sort of classical fascism, that idea of good and bad blood is based around race. But the case I was making in this piece is the idea of good and bad blood is based around Jesus. And so blood atonement theory basically says, well, Jesus has the right blood. Jesus has the blood that is innocent. Jesus has the blood that's pure. And so that's the curative blood. And when the right blood, Jesus' blood, has been spilled, well, then, salvation occurs. And so there's this idea, I think, that is just sacrificial atonement has to be part of Christian nationalism. I don't see how you can get away from that theologically. And so in the piece, I talk about that connection. I do say that not every person who holds to a blood atonement theory is the Christian nationalist, but the blood atonement theory always holds the seeds of nationalist and fascist kinds of political consequences. And so I do try to draw a distinction there, give people some room to, have a bit of an argument with me and with the tradition on that score. But, we've talked about this before, and where I stand is I think it's well past time that we move past, we get beyond blood atonement theories. And that I think is very significant in the last 2 decades that Christian theology has put this argument sort of front and center, and that there have been so many people criticizing blood atonement as the central atonement theory and putting forth all kinds of new metaphors and different kinds of scriptural ideas in its place. Because a bloody religion leads to a bloody society. Bloody faith leads to bloody politics. And so that's the point I was making. And so as everybody's screaming civil war, and then I just kind of drew some of the connections between how this worked in the 19th century with what it's doing today.
Mm-hmm. And before digging into the theological side, and even the details, about the present, I think it's just important for people to recognize that our concepts of God, the language we use about God, matters. And it doesn't matter just because, we want to make sure it comports to whatever our values are or whatnot. But like what you give allegiance to, what you worship, shapes what comes out of your life, right? So when God is an omnipotent all father up in the sky, ready to judge, wield judgment, and maybe ordains before the foundation of the world to take his kid out, so that the few elect could have eternal enjoyment, while obviously his holy love requires a large number of people to have eternal conscious torment. Like if that's what you're envisioning
right.
of a God, and who occasionally shows up in history, maybe to give rules and kill kids, then it's not surprising that the output of people that celebrate that can get ugly, right? I think that's but like patriarchy exists, right? This is one of Elizabeth Johnson, and famous feminist theologian, in her book She Who Is, says the language of God functions. It functions to what? Hold in ideologies and powers that lock things in place. So so much theology is
of that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's that's a big point. And then here you see some of the consequences, right? Like there are lots of theological reasons the kind of obsession of penal substitutionary atonement is problematic, including high quality biblical ones. But the consequences of it is it leads to a logic, a divine logic or a theologic that then implies, supports, and justifies kinds of public engagement, such that, the proper response is if we can't be in charge, then we're done with democracy.
Right.
And civil war, reasonable. And we
right,
got to that place before.
Right. Because we have to sacrifice mostly other people in order to achieve the kingdom that we imagine we deserve.
Do you think that at the beginning of the piece, you talk about your concern around the kind of growing use of civil war talk to frame our present, and then the role kind of the right wing, especially right wing Christian persecution complex plays in intensifying it? Like what makes you as a historian uncomfortable with the kind of growing use of civil war talk, and how does it play into that long-standing kind of persecution via culture trope on the right?
Well, the Civil War, I mean, just to hear people throw it around as if it's a picnic It actually reminds me of the first battles of one of the first battles of the Civil War, when people got in their carriages and went out from Washington, D.C. to the countryside of Virginia to just watch, like it was a Sunday picnic, one of the first skirmishes of the Civil War. And people were like shocked. Oh my God, there's people here who are actually dying. And that's how I think we're treating it right now. We're treating it like, oh, it's just one more thing. We've had a civil war before and we got through it. Let's take, do you want to bring the Yeti, full of beer so we can go out in the field and see who wins? And so people before the American Civil War had that kind of attitude, oh, well, it's just a thing. It's just an argument. Well, it'll be over in a day. Well, it wasn't. It was horrible, and a huge percentage of the population was killed or died as a response to it. They think that the military number alone is something like 600,000 soldiers who were killed, and there are places where Civil War battles raged, in forests in Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all these different places where they still find bodies today that had never been uncovered, because people were literally just sort of staggering off into the woods and dying from wounds. I mean, so many people died, and that's not including all the civilians who died, the towns that were burned, the economic disruption. I mean, Civil War is ugly. It was ugly here. It's ugly wherever it happens. It was ugly in Rwanda. It was ugly in the 17th century in England. And the wounds that are inflicted, that are the psychological wounds, are also, I think, long-term wounds that people get over. And so right now, the media is just sort of throwing this term around. And then, of course, there's incredible talk about, is this it? Is this it? The people who are actually jonesing for a civil war, who are in those deep, really ugly parts of the internet, they're wanting to go. They're ready. This whole thing with the FBI was basically that. It was basically, come on, bring it. We're ready. You guys fired the first shot. I wondered if the FBI raid wasn't a little bit like, the Fort Sumter. I mean, I hope not, but that's what it was sounding like, on the internet.
Yeah.
So that's what I really wanted to remind people at the beginning of that piece, that this isn't funny. This is nothing to look forward to. And really, we should be doing everything in our power to avoid the worst kinds of consequences of this sort of longing for violence, or thinking that violence is a picnic. And so that's what I was really trying to, in my writing, and certainly in all the work that I do, and I think you do this too, Tripp, try to slow people down and remember what violence really is and what violence really results in, and that this is not the will of God. And what is it that Christians can do to try to begin to, preach about, mitigate against, etc. And I don't know about folks here. There's a good number of people I can see on the Zoom thing. I guess I can't see everybody on every platform, but I have had so many pastors come to me and tell me they're afraid. They're afraid of what they can preach, what they can't preach. Their congregations are really on edge, and that has me almost as worried as everything else, because at this point, pastors aren't just afraid of, like they're going to not put money in the offering plate. Most of the people who are talking to me is that they're afraid of real violence happening in their congregations or to their families. And, that's of course what some of the folks who are fomenting civil war want you to feel. They want you to be afraid. And there's reasons to be duly cautious right now, because this is explosively bad language, and there are people with lots of guns and other motives for trying to figure out where the battlefield is right now.
So here's a question one of the homebrewed members sent in. Sammy asked, how would Diana compare the present uh, moment and its Civil War talk to what was going on in the 60s? And since Sammy's younger than me, and I don't have much memory of this past, hearing stories from people but if you don't take the secondhand knowledge from family members, if you think back to when in the 60s things were intense, how would you kind of compare and contrast the way the political and cultural structures, weren't able to handle all the tension and disagreements in a kind of cooperative way, and you saw these explosions of violence?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking a lot about this right now because of a project that I'm working on. And the 60s were, I was a little kid. And so I remember it from the view of a little kid, which means there was a way in which I thought it was kind of normal because I'd never known any other thing. Other than the daily death count about the Vietnam War on NBC Nightly News, or I never knew any other thing besides Bull Connor turning, rifles and high-powered hoses on Black people in streets in the South. And so I can remember witnessing violence through the lens of the media all the time when I was a child, and there did seem to be that war going on. And then when I was 9, I guess it was, there were riots in Baltimore City, and we could literally hear those riots from our house, and the National Guard came by our house saying we might have to evacuate. So I've actually been in a war. I guess if the National Guard tells you you're going to have to evacuate your house, that might count as a war. And it was a very uncivil kind of war. And how did it end? I think the way that it ended in the 60s was politically, when of course, Richard Nixon gets elected twice. There becomes a sort of a political move of people who are fed up with it all, towards law and order. I mean, that was the big press towards Nixon becoming president, was always law and order, law and order, law and order. And of course we kind of know what happened with that. There was this very conservative sort of turn in the culture, and people who were more liberal, who were in Congress and the Senate, had to work in different ways. And so the street violence in some ways began to mitigate in the late 60s and early 70s, especially after the Democratic National Convention, when that turned so violent, and Kent State. People really got tired of it, in other words. And there were gun laws that were passed. That was a really big deal in the 70s, is that all of a sudden one of the law and order things that went into place was to take guns away from people. And they actually did. And when guns were taken away as sort of instruments of death that you could use in just streets, violence really decreased on the streets. Now that was a political solution to a problem of violence, was to really limit access to arms. And that was a really good solution. So people were tired of, I think, of civic violence, and people were really tired of violence because of Vietnam. And so I think that just not wanting to solve our problems violently, and the whole population, both liberal and conservative, coming from different places, everybody just said, we can't have these guns. We don't want war. We got to figure out some other way into these problems. And so there was that, at least for a little while. And there was a back and forth. Well, who's going to be mostly in charge of what happens from this point on politically? And liberals kind of won for a while, and then conservatives won for a long time.
Yeah.
but it wasn't quite the level of let's have a civil war, let's destroy the streets, let's go after this, that, and the other thing. So I'm not sure how it all ended, except people kind of drifted into this sense of, we don't want this, let's just figure out how to stop it. And some of the choices I think we made in the 60s and 70s to stop it were maybe bad political choices. Well, they were bad political choices, but some of the other choices that people made at that time were actually pretty darn good choices, ones that we should have continued to make as a culture and turned our backs on.
Mm-hmm. So in that moment, thinking back to that period in the 60s where violence occurs, is also the time where you get the shift of the dominant religious community in America from mainline Protestants into conservative white evangelicals.
Eventually, yes, that does happen over that period of time.
And I wonder, sometimes people point to the clarity of mainline Protestants around integration, calls against the war in Vietnam. That was a period where you start to see the feminist movement being received in a mainline Protestant context. That was like when John Cobb had his books redone. They include inclusive language. You get the first female theology PhDs getting teaching posts in seminaries for accredited ministers, these kinds of things. And at that time, they lose cultural dominance and start that shift. And that reshaped what was the shape of religion in America in all sorts of ways. Do you think that we're at a similar point, right? Like just because we're the people that want to hang out with us, Diana, like we have plenty of liberal mainline Protestants that are like, I love when Tripp and Diana hang out, but we also have people that will mention this history and stuff about mainline Protestantism, and they're like, I don't know, I was an evangelical 6 months ago, and I had to get off the Trump train and realized that half my church was racist, so I was switching teams. And there's this new exodus, I think, coming out of evangelicalism. Some of them, will even be like at Beer Camp, like the New Evangelicals is an Instagram group and a podcast that 3 years ago in lockdown didn't exist, and now they're getting like 30,000-40,000 DMs on Twitter from people or on Instagram from people trapped in situations where they don't have religious options. They're like, I love Jesus, but what the hell's going on, right? And I wonder if you think that what's taking place will end up being a kind of splitting or a reworking on the big picture of religion in America that's similar.
Well, I actually, the book that I'm working on while I'm here, I hope it doesn't wind up being too depressing. I mean, I think I'll get out of it because I always manage to get out of my worst depressive instincts while I'm working on a book, but I sometimes have to go through a really depressive period. And so today I was doing the outline for this book, and I actually realized there was this sort of deep cyclical nature to particularly American Protestantism over the last 100 years. And I was looking at the similarities between things that happened in the 1920s and things that are happening now. And it's almost shocking to see in the 1920s the fights within Protestantism and what they resulted in versus what is going on now. And I think that one of the things that we like to, because of our historical amnesia or historical ignorance, we like to sort of privilege our contemporary time. Oh, it's never been this bad. But, in the 1920s, people were having an argument over not politics per se, but politics were sort of a secondary level issue in the fundamentalist modernist crisis. They were fighting over things like the virgin birth and literal bodily resurrection of Christ and whether or not scripture was inerrant. But churches split, people were fired, institutions were destroyed, families were not speaking with one another. There was incredible division. The Scopes monkey trial created this atmosphere of public ridicule and shaming that I wish we would have had Twitter in 1925, because I think that anti-evangelical Twitter in 1925 would be even worse than anti-Trump Twitter in 2018. And so, I mean,
I don't know if I want to wish Twitter on my grandparents, you know?
well, it's just like, imagine what had happened, and so, in the 20s, there was this terrible, brutal, bruising argument among American Protestants that really fractured any kind of cohesive political sort of response to post-pandemic and post-war America. And that becomes tied to things like the rise of the Klan and this sort of new burst of anti-Semitism that goes on in the 20s. And there are all kinds of ways that these theological arguments begin to, they fuel and support some of the really terrible political moments of the 20s, which are like today. So you have the roaring 20s, you have all the decadence and people leaving church and the huge stock market and flappers and women going to work, and you have some advances in civil rights in the 1920s. You have that side of 20s culture, and then you have that other side of 20s culture, which is a rise of white Christian nationalism and extreme forms of violence against Jews, Blacks, and some Catholic communities as late as the 1920s. So we've got this very similar thing going on. And one of the things that I realized while I was writing was that the arguments between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in their debates, and the names that they were calling each other and the insults that they were hurling at each other and stuff, were remarkably like the same sets of insults that people like Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryant were throwing at each other during the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And so all that is to say is, like, we have been through a century of this now. And what we're doing is replaying. I think we've gotten it carved in our DNA in some really crazy way, is that the divisions of American Protestantism of 100 years ago have basically rewired our epigenetics, rewired our DNA, so that now sort of trauma about religion and politics is encoded in the way that we look at the world. And so the answer to the question is, how does that get healed? How do you break through what I think now is almost, even if it's not genetically encoded, it's certainly encoded in a sense of systems theory and family stuff, that family systems theory that is going to be very hard to break out of. And so when I hear, sort of the young evangelicals who are looking around, tons of people left religion in the 1920s. In the 1920s, my grandparents abandoned religion. My grandfather hated religion. He thought it was the source of everything that was wrong with the world. And my grandmother left the Catholic Church because she felt like the Catholic Church betrayed her. And so we forget that all of this has happened before. That should mean, for people like your young evangelical listeners, the new evangelical listeners, is that yes, this is our story. It's distinctive to our time, but we're living in a bigger, longer history of this story. And that means in the longer stretch of time, there's going to be wisdom that was shared along the way. There were going to be people who made right decisions along the way. And there were going to be people who made really bad decisions along the way. And part of our job, I think, in helping us heal and helping us get to a different place, is to be able to really examine that history and to be able to interrogate it and pull out the strands and say, okay, this piece this will help me now. This will help the future move to a better sort of outcome. And this is a thing we want to avoid, ever again.
Mhm.
So that's, you know me. I mean, that's one of my big things is looking and seeing how we live in the larger story.
Yeah.
And once we figure out how we live in that larger story, really grab hold of the wisdom that larger story teaches us and recognize, I think it helps because then we say we have friends. See, right now, so many people feel alone. They feel like, oh, I've abandoned my family, or, I've turned my back on my parents' heritage. Well, you don't know that. You probably don't know what your great grandparents thought in the 1920s about religion. It could very well be that they were infidel and non-religious people in the 1920s. And it was somewhere along the line that your grandparents or your parents became fundamentalists. So maybe you're going back to your true family's history by rejecting religion. You don't know.
One of my office mates at the University of Edinburgh was a scholar of secularity and religion in Europe. And he regularly pointed out, he's like, people go, oh, secularization thesis in Europe. He's like, yeah, it's happened 6 times. Like if you
right.
they kept track. He's like, the Catholic Church has good records. There's large chunks of Europe that just has never been very religious. And then the revivals happen, and there's like a 50 years where everyone goes all the time, and then they complain that God left Europe, and then it comes back. He's like, I don't count y'all out, Tripp. Anyway, he's like, with the way things are going, I wouldn't be surprised if it came back there first. And while America's still bitterly anti-religious because of all the right-wing nut jobs, and I was like, I don't know. I would never try to out-religion America. If we could trade in God for mammon any moment. To
bring it back just real quickly, we can even push it a little bit back beyond that. And one of the consequences of the Civil War that people tend to forget about is that immediately in the sea, the river of blood that was flowing across the United States after the war, with all of those people who died, people found Christianity to be deeply inadequate. And so it was in the post-Civil War period that you get the first real powerful expression of American atheism. And atheism actually becomes a sort of an evangelistic religion. After the Civil War, Robert Ingersoll becomes one of the most famous figures in late 19th century religion, and he's the great atheist. And he was constantly, going on these preaching tours and convincing people to not believe in God. And his evidence was the Civil War. And so there was Ingersoll, and people also turned toward. Again, this was a very early sort of turning toward Eastern religions for answers rather than Western religion. They didn't feel like Western religion was adequate to answer the questions about why had brothers killed brothers? Why had people who all claimed to be Christians come to hate one another to the point of shedding all of this blood? And so they said, well, I don't want any part of that. Can I become a Hindu? And the world, you get the introduction of yoga, you get the introduction of world's religions as actual real practices. Theosophy grew after the Civil War. People turned to mediumship in order to be able to talk to their dead relatives. They didn't go to your local Baptist church and say, oh, I'll meet you again in heaven. They left those churches because those churches came up with stupid answers, and they had contributed to what went on during the Civil War. And so they turned to going to seances. And so, anybody who thinks you're going to have a civil war and on the other end of it, you're going to have some perfectly purified Christian America, go back and look at the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. That is one of the periods of American history where the churches were going nuts trying to figure out how do we get people to come back because we failed. And you can see that records, people belonged, but they belonged because people got baptized. You can't tell how faithful anybody was. And so somebody might be like technically a Presbyterian, but their spirituality was down the street at the house of the medium.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of lived religion or practiced religion or people's religion, depending on the particular school of inquiry, is fascinating because like even the stories say like contemporary atheist evangelists tell about science explaining away religion is kind of undercut when you actually look at the biographies of many of the great scientists that undercut religion, that they're practicing theosophy and going to seances and all kinds of stuff, like, you know, major. Anyway, that there was something you said that I, knowing that you're working on a book on this, and know this might be the freshest it ever is, and it just makes me want to ask this question. Might be on a slightly nerdy detour, but I feel like it's my job to do this. So you use the image of epigenetics. Now, I know in Facebook there was a couple of people that asked about it. So epigenetics, relatively new research that you obviously have your genes, and then there are different genes that get turned on or triggered on or off. And one of the things that can happen is that across generations, genes that get turned on because you are conceived in a time of intense stress or whatever, it then turns on a particular gene. And these epigenetic markers, things that activate potential active genes and shut off other ones, that as an image for thinking about cycles in American religion is just fascinating, right? Because what do religions know? Like, what do our response when people are like, well, Christianity is just a bunch of white supremacist racists, blah, 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 blah. You're like, yeah. And then you pull out a people's history of the church, you know, like your church history book. And you're like, but there's all these other cool people. And they're like, I don't like that gene code because the people giving me a hard time, they had that epigenetic selection for being a racist asshole. So that image is rather fascinating because a number of the research things on how you address multi-generation epigenetics connects to, and you mentioned family systems analysis, the impact of anxiety at natal states. So this is
right
from conception until you get language. In that period, if you as an adult, when you're an adult, if you in that time from conception, so at that point, primarily related to your mother, who we as a state should fund healthcare, healthy nutrients, the ability to thrive and exercise and all these kinds of things. Great way to avoid all sorts of negative outcomes. And when you're first born, having people that love you make eye contact, having your needs met, a mom that can, if they're able to breastfeed and have all the nutrients. There are tons in that one period of life. All these biological triggers happen that then shape the way you develop the rest of your life. And if you, let's say, have certain triggers from trauma that women in your family have experienced, multi-generational, like what is required to break those triggers that may lead to higher blood pressure or anxiety disorder and all these kinds of things? What is the trigger? It actually is the same thing that if you're trying to break unhealthy things at the systems level in family systems. It's a community of affirmation. It is a non-anxious presence, and it's the recognition that you get without doing anything. Now, we all know what that looks like as an adult, where occasionally there are people that love you, value, and they communicate it. But what does that mean prior to language? It's so much of that support becomes biologically through the mother, and then by the people that hold you as an infant and care for your needs. And so when you were saying that, this is my long prep for why I was excited about this idea. Let's imagine, Diana, that we were ministers in the present seeing this ugliness. Like one point, what do you do after you've already had these triggers selected? You have this inheritance and it's ugly. Create communities of non-anxious presence and affirmation. And then those are the very few spaces that you could get healed, even if you're bringing this ugliness in. But if we saw that cycle and said, how do we break it? Right. Then faith communities would be places where what breaks a cycle? That kind of prenatal and early childhood affirmation, where the religious spaces and the homes that bring them in actually perform to them the promise we give at baptism. And I think that's such a different way of thinking about that mission, because if we put all of our energy at ranting on Twitter, blogging, doing our podcast, complaining and venting all the time. We're just joining the rest of us that have been stuck in this cycle.
Right. And I worry about that.
Yeah, that was what I thought of when you said that. And I was like, oh, that's so good. I knew there's a reason Diana Butler Bass is a genius. And but wouldn't it be cool though to recognize that the person at your congregation most committed to the church in 100 years is the nursery worker who holds them and looks them and changes their diaper and says you're loved.
Yeah. Or the Sunday school teacher.
Yeah. That's what I'm talking about.
In the kindergarten class. And, it reminds me of the story that I tell in Freeing Jesus about how I was, I think it was the summer of 2015, 2016, someplace right in there. I was at Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. And the wonderful pastor there, Ginger Gaines Sorelli, she was giving the children's sermon. And she's sitting up front, classic Protestant thing, sitting on the stairs up at the chancel. And the point of her sermon was, where is God? And she's sitting there and she says to little kids, where's the candle? And one little kid, sees a candle on the altar and goes and gets a candle. And then she goes, where's the bread? Little kid goes and gets the bread, brings it over. And so she goes through all this stuff for about, 3 minutes or so. And then finally she said, where's God? And little kids look around, it's like, oh, where is God? And at this point, one of the little kids said, I know. And everybody in the congregation is going, what? And the kid jumped up from the chancel, ran up the center aisle, and his father is like, oh my gosh, where's my son going? And the back doors of the church are open in the streets of Washington, D.C. He's worried about his kid running off on 16th Street, and the kid just darts somewhere. And before the dad could catch him, the little boy was back in the sanctuary and was holding the hand of a woman who was about 70 years old. And he was bringing her into the congregation. And Ginger says, what? Why is Miss Jean here? And he said, God, you asked me where God is. Here's God. It was a Sunday school teacher. I mean, literally, the kid thought that his Sunday school teacher was God. I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, you got to wonder, how that kid's going to understand faith. I mean, there is some incredibly special love that was going on there between that 70-year-old lady and those little kids in that class. So that little boy, when he's asked the question, where is God? The first thing he thinks of is his Sunday school teacher. And he runs and gets her and brings her in. And that's an actual real lived illustration of exactly what you're talking about. And so those kinds of things do break the cycle. And so the question becomes, what happens when the church is participatory in the cycle and not something that breaks the cycle? And that, of course, is what the Catholic Church is dealing with right now. It has participated in the cycle of abuse. And that's what white evangelical churches are dealing with. They have participated in this cycle of abuse. And mainline churches, I'm not going to let us completely off the hook here, because while I think some mainline churches get it incredibly right, like that story about Foundry and the little boy, we also have the places where we don't get it right, where the kind of epigenetic trauma has not been healed. Because you think of all the mainline congregations where all they want to do is just replicate the past without thinking about what it means to create a different future. And some of that past replication has certainly included racism. It's certainly included abuse of different sorts. It's certainly included anti-immigrant attitudes. And so this is a really important set of questions for churches right now, and how are cycles broken, and all of that wonderful research that was done primarily in the 80s and 90s around family systems theory, which sadly, I hear too many younger mainline ministers mocking.
Yeah.
That's some of the very research we most need right now. We really do not need in mainline churches more clarity on what Augustine taught about double
Are you
predestination.
sure? Because it's so beautiful. We know that what you really need is more Karl Barth, right, Diana?
Yeah, that's right. We're back to Carl again. But what we do need is beautiful theology. I'm all for beautiful theology. Everybody knows that. But we also need real practical ways of being able to break this 100-year cycle that we've been living in, so that churches can be genuinely prophetic and healing, and communities of wisdom in the midst of what is really, this terrible cultural moment, and can stop the violence rather than contribute to it.
Yeah. For those that aren't familiar with family systems theory, if you go to the Homebrewed YouTube channel and just scroll back at some point, I found this video of Edwin Friedman, who's a Jewish family systems theorist, therapist, who his book Failure of Nerve is one of the best books ever. But he wrote the book that was most assigned pastoral care book for mainline Protestant seminaries for like 20 some years, called Generation to Generation, which is the family systems textbook at a lot of mainline Protestant schools. But there's a video where he introduces family systems and process theology at the same time.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I did a lot of work to find the video and then couldn't find it anywhere or a way to buy it. So I just put it on the internet, and it is like the best hour and 10 minutes. And if I have ever like significant issues, I just watch it. And because, well, one, I'm already kind of into the process. So then when he's like connecting it to family systems, like, oh yeah. And Michael Kerr, who's a medical psychology, medical doctor, had a recent book kind of bringing together a whole lot of the research in family systems theory, where so much more of it is being tested now. Biological systems theory has grown tons. And so I do find it likewise disturbing that so much of the pastoral care space, that something much more rigorous is being occupied by other things that are in education. But well, I don't want to derail, but we had a couple really fun questions that people sent in, Diana.
Okay.
And sometimes we get going and then we don't get to them.
We miss them. I know.
Because
we're both extroverts.
It's true. And I like long intros and outros of hanging out, because there's a certain select number of people listen to the podcast as the way they socialize while doing things, especially if you're a parent and don't get to hang out with other adults. I understand some people right now, you're doing dishes and you're like, I love my friends Diana and Tripp. Okay, so here's a fun question, Diana. If you were going to host a dinner party and any three people from church history were going to come over and have dinner with you and Richard, who are you inviting? And bonus, you get to pick one friend. And they said, other than me, which I was kind of sad about, other than me, to come. So it's like a friend and three people from any point in church history, you and Richard, dinner party. And then maybe after you go to the cottage and you have a live podcast, because why not when you have figures from church history around?
I'm actually wondering if this is a question from one of the students I taught at Rhodes College, because my final for my church history class was construct a dinner party.
Well, I don't, hold on. Will you answer the question? I'll go see who sent it.
I think I would like to have Oscar Romero, Frederick Douglass, and Hildegard of Bingen.
That is a collection. Melissa, last name starts with T. I just wrote Melissa T. Said it. Okay. And so now that you have that opportunity, which of your friends are you going to grace with the chance to hang out at this?
Oh, which of my friends now? I can't pick, because then I'll have a whole bunch of people mad at me.
Okay. See, aren't you about to hang out with Mary Ann? That's what I was thinking, you know.
Yeah, I'm about to hang out with Marianne Borg next week. That'll be really fun. I don't know who I would like to have. I would like to construct two dinner parties. I'd like to have a historical dinner party, and then I would just love to have a contemporary, dinner party with amazing people that I don't get to see very often. So,
Okay, well, who are you gonna put on that one?
well, lots of people from Wild Goose, that's for sure.
Don't you want to have dinner with Michelle Obama? I kind of want to have dinner with Michelle Obama.
Yeah. Oh, she would be amazing to have dinner with. I think she would be that. Yeah, that would be cool. I think Michelle Obama, Bill McKibben.
I want to hang out. I want to have dinner with Cornel West, or have him on the podcast.
I want a poet. I'm trying to think about, but my poets are all dying, and so it's like Mary Oliver, but she just died a little while ago. But yeah, I want a poet and a novelist, and yeah, I think those would be my three: Michelle
Wendell
Obama,
Berry.
Bill McKibben, and yeah, maybe he's a little irascible from what I understand.
I was looking at comments. Amanda Gorman, the throwing in. Is it one of the other questions? There were two people that actually brought it up. Was if you had thoughts about the passing of Frederick Buechner, and knowing that you were off the grid, I didn't know if you knew, but
yeah,
when you think of figures across our mutual friends, people, the number of people that would list him as someone that shaped their understanding of their own faith, I mean, there's not a lot that big.
yeah, I did hear that. That reached me because I'm with all these ministers and lots of church people up here, and so little things sneak through on our cell phones, and that people were talking about at dinner. And with Frederick Buechner, I think that one of the things that was amazing about him is this certain kind of literary figure from the 20th century that I feel sad we don't have right now. And that is the person who is the poet, the novelist, the sermonizer, the writer of theology, and a wise observer of culture. I mean, he put all of those literary pieces together. And we lived in a culture in the late 20th century that really valued that kind of voice. Not everybody had it. I think Kathleen Norris came kind of close to it in the late 20th century as well. She's still with us, thank goodness. But I think Buechner might be last of a breed. That is a very sort of classic theological, literary, poetic sort of person that has been an American sort of character over a long time in our history. We've had people like that going well back into the 19th century, and I think we don't have that very much right now. Mm-hmm. It has to do a lot, not because we're less talented. I think it has a lot to do with publishing. It has a lot to do with, I think, corporatization of books and literature. And so I think we're losing out because of the shifts in book culture. We're losing a type, an American figure. And I think Buechner is a example of the last of that kind of type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know when I was a campus minister, the number of people whose vision for what they were going to do with their education changed dramatically by reading Buechner.
Oh, wow. That's neat. Parker Palmer does that some.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He's a very similar kind of figure in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so last of the fun questions for today. Though those of you that sent one, and high quality, the tweet from Progressive, that's a silent Twitter account because he's a Southern Baptist minister. Baptist minister whose normal Twitter account does not engage us. But he'll be at beer camp. It'd be a second beer camp. But he sent a fun one about creating a process party track to leave at conservative Calvinist context. But we'll do that at beer camp because that's fun. But another one was last time I heard you both enjoy the same piece of media, film or TV was the mass.
Midnight Mass.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
the question was, are there any TV shows or films recently that you got into, not just for sheer enjoyment reasons, but for, intellectually stimulating ones? And I'll say mine while you think. That
Okay,
way,
thanks.
because I got to read it in advance. But the two that come to mind, one, Miss Marvel. I love all the MCU stuff. I love Thor: Love and Thunder, which I have a podcast or two about, so you could go listen to those, because Thor: Love and Thunder, Jane becoming Thor, the God Butcher who's butchering gods for theodicy reasons, great. Comic book version's better, but Miss Marvel is so freaking good. It is so good. And one of my friends, it's a Muslim religion scholar, and I've been texting back and forth, and he's been sharing with me things, other like adolescents in his own congregation and stuff. We're talking about seeing their culture represented and expressed in this like really fun, like MCU way, where like the actual normal life of a Muslim family in America and in the West is explored and stuff has been hyped. So like seeing how they had all this hype and they haven't had it before, kind of like when Adam Clark and I were doing a class when Black Panther came out. And so many people that before, all you have a bunch of white superheroes, and now like you have this like new super cool one, and you have the whole like celebration of African culture that's present, and it becomes a cultural moment, and everyone's like, oh wow, this is the best MCU movie. Like the hearing those testimonies while just watching it with my kid, who in Edinburgh had plenty of Muslim school kids, didn't think anything about that part. Where he's like, yeah, like I go to school with them, and then coming back here and hearing those, it's real exciting. And then to make a teenager a superhero that's that high powered. I'm not going to reveal what happens at the end of the season in case someone hasn't watched it yet, but that's exciting. And the last one, to promissory note, is the new Lord of the Rings show. I'm so excited. Jason, Michelle, and I, one of Diana and I's mutual friends, runs Crackers and Grape Juice. We're doing a Tolkien class right now, where we had John Garth, who's like the greatest living Tolkien biographer, join, and Tom Emanuel, UCC minister that's doing a PhD on like queer Tolkien readings. And anyway, we're doing that right now because there's a new show coming out in September. And I'm like beyond pumped. I hope it's really good or really horrible so I can make fun of it on behalf of the books. I hope it's not middle of the road, but I'm so pumped. The last episode we found out yesterday when they released the schedule comes out the night before beer camp. So we can do a late night after beer camp's officially done, watch party / drinking game / commentary track to the end of the season. So I'm pretty excited about it. But I love
That's great.
Anyone that wants to go get all the lectures from like actual Tolkien scholars from the class can. I think it's tolkienheadpod.com. But Miss Marvel, Tolkien show coming up. Yeah, those are the things that I got excited, but still, I don't know. I hope the Tolkien show like gets to Midnight Mass awesome, but that was pretty outstanding.
So this is one of the places where I actually learned from people like you and Jason, because even when I was in college and seminary, lots of my friends were into Dungeons and Dragons, and that was the Tolkien kind of craze of the 70s and 80s, and so I always had friends that were reading that kind of literature and loved those books and things, and that's really not ever really been my sort of made my heart pound.
I mean, I don't picture you rolling a D20 with a little cosplay costume on.
No.
But if you did, Diana, you would be a mage. I'm confident.
Oh, well, thank you. I think that's a compliment.
Yeah. No, they're in the magician class, but they also have a high awareness of history and lore and are able to weave their wisdom and magic and to lead a group of people. Also tend to be a figure that brings the community together for the mission and such, and regularly stays in the back, but cast healing spells to help their co-players on their team survive deep treaches through dungeons. So, oh,
okay. Well, I'll sign up there. But just what I'm watching now, and I mean, I have to confess, I'm generationally boring. And that is, I am very happy that Grantchester is back on PBS, which is the lovely show about conflicted Anglican rectors in the 1950s, who are living right at the edge of the end of World War II and before the sexual revolution and all the stuff that happens in the 1960s, and they're trying to navigate parish life at this really interesting moment of change. And so each year the Grantchester seems to have a theme that develops, and this year uh, this year I haven't quite figured out exactly what the theme is. Sometimes it's like men's problems, what it means to be a man in society, what is spirituality. We've had a lot of women villains on Grantchester this season, which is sort of interesting. So I'm kind of I think that the season that we're looking at is a lot about brokenness. Several of the major characters have real crises going on in their lives about broken relationships, or their health is broken, or their hopes have been destroyed for some reason. There's this wonderful character who used to be the curate, and he was found to be gay, and so he's kicked out of the ministry, and he's developed this really wonderful relationship with this older housekeeper at the vicarage. You see, look at me, I can get so excited about these things. But now he's become basically a beat poet and runs a coffee shop in Cambridge, where all these students are coming and listening to Alan Watts poetry and stuff. And so it's just really interesting to look at this. I love this kind of British sort of cozy drama approach, where you're taking a look at a very small world, but it actually winds up being a commentary on a bigger world. And so Downton Abbey was like that, looking at a very small world of a family in the 1920s. And Grantchester is the very small world of a parish in Cambridge in the 1950s. And so I'm just excited about that. And I love watching that. And right now, not only do I love watching that, but I was really into this. I'm really into cooking shows.
Have you seen Dairy Girls?
Cooking shows are great. No, I haven't watched Dairy Girls. People keep telling me I should watch it. I know it's on Netflix.
I know, hearing your description, Dairy Girls is like the Irish teenage version of like hanging out with this group of high school teenage girls, and like during the tensions, Protestant Catholic tensions in Ireland, and the prep school boy that becomes their friends that's English. And I'll just say, I would not have believed how accurate the show was until watching it with my Irish neighbors in Scotland, and then hearing their stories, and they're like, yes, this is my friend group. And then when their friends would come visit for like first communion for their kids and stuff, I would meet these characters I'd heard stories, and then go, oh, so this was your biography. Dairy Girls, but they're at a Catholic school, which makes the whole thing entertaining.
That is such the style of so much UK television, and is the small world becomes the illustration of the big world. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think American literature works the opposite direction. American literature always goes for sweep, and then sort of moves into like Chesapeake, or mm-hmm. some of lots of big sort of panoramic kinds of literature, and then going for the smaller lessons that you draw out of the big horizon. So there's I've always liked the British approach of the little picture that leads to the bigger one. So anyway, that's kind of what I've been watching. And cooking shows are great because you get something really great in a half an hour.
Plus, you got to know what to do. You got to know what to do when Frederick Douglass and Hildegard come over for
come
dinner.
To dinner. Don't forget Oscar Romero.
Yes. What a collection.
Well, I read a great novel I want to suggest it to people. Not just all about watching TV, but when I was at the beach 2 weeks ago, which is something I just do, and I put away all of my work and do mystery novels or what have you for a week out there. I read Lauren Groff's book, Matrix, which I highly recommend to all of those people who were completely compelled by my Mary Magdalene sermon. Because Matrix is historical fiction about a young woman who is the bastard child of King Geoffrey II, the Plantagenet king. And Geoffrey II's daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, does not like the fact that Geoffrey II, her father-in-law, had this bastard daughter. Sees her as a sort of a rival to the rightful Plantagenet line. And so she sends her off to a failing abbey to become the abbess. And over the course, she sends her away because she doesn't want to have her around to even have to marry her off when she's barely 20, to oversee this place, this abbey, where basically they think she's going to die with all the nuns because there's this terrible disease that's going through the convent, and half of them have died anyway. And what winds up in the book happening is that this young woman saves the abbey, and it's a historical novel about medieval women and feminist theology and female power and all of these themes that I, just that I love, more than anything else in theology. And it is a wonderful, wonderful novel. It was on Obama's list of his favorite novels last year. And when I got to the end of it, my final reaction to the book was, and I won't say anything else other than that. But I have never had that. Richard will tell you that I literally gasped at the end of the book. And I said, and I said, do you want me to tell you what I just gasped at? He said, no, I want to read it. I have never had that as my final reaction to a book.
Wow. That's awesome. Look, this has been totally fun hanging out. I'm glad it worked to do it while you're in a cabin in Wyoming. I am looking forward to getting to hang out in person at a beer camp. Everyone, remember, if you're a part of the cottage, you message Diana, she'll give you a secret code. You get $100 off. If you aren't one, you can join and then get the code, because you'll get more off than you spent being a member of the cottage for a year, and you get to hang out with us quite regularly as we do these type of things just for members. If you make a poor life decision and don't want to do so, use the code RUININGDINNER. No spaces. The website's theologybeer.camp. And a couple people asked, yes, there's all ages at Theology Beer Camp. The number of people that are at the late night soirees, the average age drops. There's always like a few people over 70 that stay up very late. And then you're like, I do it once a year. And it's usually it's something you do, Tripp. But the structure is set. We're all in the morning. There's like contemplative prayer time and stuff, the more normal talks and type things, do fun stuff. And then after dinner, there's a podcast that then turns into a party. So it's set for people that do have bedtimes to not miss any of the content, and then be able to wake up chipper for contemplative prayer and coffee stuff before the session. So don't worry.
And one thing I think Tripp and I are deeply committed to is great intergenerational friendship.
Yes.
And great intergenerational conversation and learning from one another, listening to each other's worlds. And I think that some of the things that we do is just the best at that, so beer camp, Wild Goose, those are great intergenerational events. People forget Wild Goose is really intergenerational too.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it goes from little kids up to 80-year-olds. I mean, really, it's just amazing.
Yes. And there'll be other opportunities to hang out with us in the future. We'll let you know about. But even if you aren't coming to beer camp, you should still become a member of the cottage, because it is always nice to have well-supported, wonderful, progressive Christian voices in the public square. And I'm thrilled we get to be friends. And
yes.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to hanging out soon and giving you your teacup. I was thinking of making whatever your favorite mixed drink is and putting it in it at beer camp. just because I thought that is a high quality Instagram post. If you have the Queen's teacup with like a gin and tonic in it, it feels like real on point.
Okay, so you got it right there. Gin and tonic.
Oh, you're a gin and tonic person?
I am.
My favorite person in the world's a gin and tonic person.
Your wife?
Yes, that's my favorite person. No, I wasn't talking about you. That'd be real awkward to share right now in front of lots of people. I mean, you're up there. You're one of my favorite. You're one of my favorite people, but like my favorite, she loves some gin and tonics.
That's great. I always think it's kind of a WASP stereotype, but I really do love really good gin.
Yeah. Well, in Edinburgh, it was the hipster drink because they think Scotch all the time. So a lot of distilleries started making gin. And so at the University of Edinburgh Divinity School faculty meetings on Fridays at 4, which involve about 10 minutes of serious stuff and 2 hours of gin and tonics. That's where I got used to drinking them. And Alicia's like, they have gin at your staff meetings? I'm like, staff meetings generous.
It's not a Baptist college.
It's not. It's not.
And I love what Jan Sutherland just put in the chat over on the Zoom thing. Do we know what the Queen has in her teacup? I don't know. If I had her kids, I might be like straight whiskey from Scotland, the Scottish Highlands. It's just like, what has Charles done now?
Yeah. So, Diane, one of the Sullen just messaged, how do they reach out to you to get your discount code?
I actually, if they have been a paid member of the cottage for a little while, when you got the last Ruining Dinner invitation, there was a thing called Cottage Insiders that came out a few days ago. That has the code in it. So the best way for me to send the code to the people who are registered, which I will continue to do, is on the Cottage Insider emails, which come out about once every 2 weeks. I'll put in the actual code.
And I'll send you this recording so you can attach it when you email it to them. So when you email,
that's a great idea too.
You can just put it on there.
I'll just put it on there.
That's a really obvious solution that I apparently took time to think of. Anyway.
Well, I'm really happy that I could make the cottage a cabin this week.
I know.
Or cabin the cottage, however that would work.
And a couple of people joked that I now look like I'm at the cottage because of the books in the background, but I'm slowly setting up here. But soon, all these empty books in that fireplace.
Oh my, you got a nice
I'm gonna have that in the background. I have that in the background. And I may even just stick a pipe in my mouth just for flair one day. Maybe when we get to Christmas. I don't know.
Fireplace. We can hang the stockings over it. So hey, everybody, hang in there. Work against civil war. That's my main.
We're officially against it. My main
advice to everyone here is whatever you can do, press back on the Civil War thing, and let's keep our eyes on the prize. Is a community of peaceableness, and that doesn't mean you're a wimp. It doesn't mean that you don't speak against justice. It doesn't mean that you don't speak out against idiocy. You do all the right stuff. You do good stuff. But let's see what it means to really dedicate ourselves to breaking that century-long cycle of division and violence within Protestantism that's fed the division and violence that we have now.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for hanging out. And remember, that was like a little teaser of what Diane's doing in her next book. So you got to get ready to get that one. But we'll see you all soon at the next Ruining Dinner.